Every man who walked those 42 acres in the spring of 2009 looked at the same thing. They saw the same cracked hardpan, the same brittle fescue going nowhere, the same creek bed that had been dry since August and would stay dry, by most accounts, until it rained something more than a drizzle. Every soil scientist, every county extension agent, every neighboring farmer who'd watched that parcel sit idle for 11 years, they all looked at it and saw the same flaw. The ground was spent. The water was gone. And they were all wrong. Somebody had to write this one down, or it would have been forgotten. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, take a second to subscribe before we go any further. The rest of it matters. The Hargrove property sat in the southwest corner of Jefferson County, Alabama, out past a cluster of volunteer pines on the downhill side of CR 51. The listing from Talladega Savings and Trust described it as 42 acres, row crop, current use, none. A neighbor who'd farmed the adjoining parcel for 30 years had looked at it and declined. A cattle operation out of Shelby County had sent a man in a Chevy Silverado 2500 to walk it in February, and that man had turned around and driven home without making an offer. By March, the price had been cut from $14,000 to $8,500. By early May, it sat at $5,000, which, for a parcel that size in Jefferson County, was as close to free as land got without actually being donated. The bank was not trying to make money anymore. The bank was trying to get it off the books before the end of the fiscal quarter. Warren Elliott, who was 73 years old and had spent most of his life farming cotton and soybeans in Bibb County, drove out to look at the Hargrove parcel on a Thursday afternoon in April, not because he was buying anything, but because his daughter asked him to. She'd been watching that listing for weeks. Warren didn't think much of it, not from the road. He pulled his Ford F-250 onto the gravel turnout, got out, stood there a few minutes, and drove home. He told her it was dry ground, told her the creek bed was dead, told her it would take 5 years and more money than she had to make anything grow on it. She thanked him for going. She made the call to the bank the next morning. Her name was Darius Elliott. Not a girl. The name sometimes confused people. But a 24-year-old man, Warren's youngest. The one who'd come back from 2 years at Tuskegee without a degree, but with a notebook full of ideas his father had never seen and wasn't sure he understood. Darius had $5,200 in a savings account, the result of 4 years working weekends at a John Deere parts counter in Center Point. He had no tractor, no equipment, no cattle, and no operating loan. What he had was the notebook, and a question he'd been sitting on since the previous October, when he'd driven out to the Hargrove parcel alone on a Saturday afternoon and spent 3 hours on the ground. The question was about the creek. Not whether the creek was dry, it clearly was. The question was why the hardpan cracked the way it did. He'd looked at the pattern of cracking along the old creek channel. He'd pulled on a pair of rubber boots and walked the dry bed north to south, then south to north, slow, and he'd noticed something that the neighbor hadn't, and the Shelby County cattleman hadn't, and Warren Elliott hadn't. At a particular bend, approximately 300 feet north of the property's southern fence line, the crack pattern changed direction, not dramatically. But it changed. And the soil there, where it cracked, was not the pale gray that most of the dry bed showed. It was darker, slightly darker. The way soil gets when moisture rises from below and isn't quite reaching the surface, but is closer than it ought to be. He took 4 soil samples from that bend. He bagged them and labeled them and sent them to the soil testing lab at Auburn 2 weeks later. He had the results in his notebook. The results, to most people, would have been meaningless. The catch and exchange capacity in those 4 samples was measurably higher than in the 12 other samples he'd taken from the rest of the property. That meant organic activity. That meant something had been feeding that soil not long ago. And the texture, the way the sample broke and crumbled in his hand, that was not the texture of ground that had been dry since the Ice Age. That was the texture of ground that had been wet inside in the last few years, without anyone knowing it was. He didn't know exactly what he was looking at. He wanted to be honest about that. But he had enough to make the call. He closed on the Hargrove property on May 18, 2009, for $5,000. He paid cash from the savings account. He had $200 left. Warren Elliott did not say he told you so, not out loud. But Darius knew what his father was thinking, because he'd grown up knowing what his father was thinking. Warren was a quiet man, not cold, just economical with his words in the way men get, who've spent 30 years alone in a cab with nobody to talk to but a CB radio and a diesel engine. He'd raised 4 children on a Bibb County spread that was never big enough and never had enough rain, and he'd done it by paying attention. Not to trends, not to markets, not to what the other farmers were doing. To the land. To the way a field looked at 6 in the morning when the dew sat different on the low spots. To the sound of soil when you pressed it. He'd given Darius the notebook the fall before. Not his original notebooks. Those were older, held together with rubber bands, kept in a filing cabinet in the back room, but a fresh one, a green-covered composition book. And he'd told Darius to write down everything he noticed and nothing he assumed. There was a difference between the two, he said, and most people didn't know what it was. Warren had learned to read land the way his own father had taught him. In the early 1960s, in a time and a county where a black man farming his own ground was not guaranteed to stay that way. His father, Elmore Elliott, had kept careful records, not just of crop yields, but of water. Where it pooled, where it drained, where it ran off, and where it sat. Elmore had drawn crude maps in pencil, each parcel labeled, each seasonal waterway traced. He'd told Warren that water was the one thing a man couldn't plant. It was either there or it wasn't, and the ones who knew where it was would always outlast the ones who didn't. Elmore had farmed 31 acres in Bibb County from 1952 until he died in 1988. He had never owned more than 1 tractor at a time. First a Farmall M, then a Ford 8N he bought used in 1961 with money from a cotton sale, and there were years when the income from those 31 acres came out to less than what a man at the feed store made in a week. He never borrowed against the land. That was the one thing he would not do. His wife, Louise, had pressed him twice in the 1970s when money was short enough to feel dangerous, and both times Elmore had said the same thing. The bank could not foreclose on a man who owed the bank nothing. So they did without. They planted a kitchen garden. They ran a few head of hogs. They kept chickens. And in the evenings, after supper, Elmore sat at the kitchen table with his pencil and his ledger and wrote down what he'd seen that day in the fields. Not yields, not expenses, but observations. The way the morning fog broke over the creek. Which rows the water stood in longest after a hard rain, where the soil changed color at plow depth, and what that change might mean. He passed those ledgers to Warren when he died, 11 of them, dating from 1958. The handwriting in the early ones was careful and slow, the letters of a man who had not had much formal schooling, but understood that the act of writing a thing down made you look at it twice. The later ones were faster, more shorthand, abbreviations Elmore had invented for himself that Warren had to puzzle out in the weeks after the funeral. It took Warren 2 years to read all 11 ledgers. He was not a fast reader, and the work didn't slow down because a man's father died. But he read them, evenings, after the children were in bed, and he understood more each time he went back to the fields the next morning with something from the night before still turning in his mind. The ledgers were not instruction. They were a record of looking. Of a man spending 30 years paying attention to the same ground, from different angles, in different seasons, across different years, watching what never changed and what did. Warren had kept those pencil maps. He'd added to them. And when Darius started asking questions about the Hargrove parcel, at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, across a dinner table that had started getting quieter as the other children left, Warren had not discouraged him. He'd just made him go look a second time, and a third. He'd also done something he hadn't told Darius about until the following year. He'd pulled out Elmore's fourth ledger from 1964 and looked up an entry dated July 11 of that year, in which Elmore described walking the boundary of a neighboring parcel, not Hargrove. That land had different owners then, going back further, and noting that the creek feeding from the northwest had what he called a ghost feel to it. His phrase, a ghost feel, meant a creek that ran cold even in August, even in dry years, which Elmore took as a sign of deep feed. Artesian, or near artesian. The kind of spring that didn't care what the summer looked like because it wasn't being driven by rainfall. That parcel had changed hands 4 times between 1964 and 2009. Nobody who owned it after 1974 had kept records or paid the kind of attention Elmore had. The culvert failed in the 1990s, and the surface water disappeared, and the land died in the way that dry ground dies, slowly, then faster, then all at once, until the last buyer walked away and the bank inherited 42 acres nobody wanted. That was Warren's method. You looked twice. You read what other people had written before you looked. If it still looked right the third time, it probably was. What Darius had found, what he would not be able to confirm until June of that year, was an artesian spring. Not a dramatic one, not a geyser, not something you'd see in a magazine, a subterranean flow that had at some point in the mid-1990s been inadvertently partially blocked by a collapsed culvert at the northern boundary of the property, the remnant of an old drainage project from 1978. The culvert had failed slowly, backing up the flow over the course of years, starving the creek bed of the water that had historically kept it alive. The surface creek had gone dry because the water that fed it had been rerouted underground by the blockage, pushed deeper. Sitting in the aquifer below the bend Darius had noticed, darker soil, different crack pattern, going nowhere, building pressure at about 19 feet below grade. He knew none of this in May. He knew the soil data. He knew the pattern. He made the purchase on evidence, not certainty. And he knew the difference between those two things. In the first week of June 2009, he rented a hand auger from a farm supply in Birmingham. No brand, just a rusted pull cable model he got for $60 a week. And he went down to the bend and started boring. His cousin Marcus was with him. They didn't have the money for a proper well drill and didn't know yet if they needed one. Marcus was 27, worked 3 days a week at a lumber yard in Hewatown, and was not particularly optimistic about the plan. He brought 2 sandwiches and a gallon of sweet tea and said if they didn't hit anything by afternoon, he was going home. They started at 7 in the morning. The auger was slow. The ground in the upper 5 feet was nearly concrete hard, the kind of July-baked clay that won't give without a fight, and Darius worked the handle in shifts with Marcus. 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off, trading without speaking much. The first 10 feet took 4 hours. Marcus had one of the sandwiches at 10 o'clock and didn't say anything about going home. They hit soft ground at 14 feet. Noticeably different, the auger moved through it differently, pulled rather than pushed, and when they brought up the bit, the soil on it was darker than what had come up before, and it clumped differently, the way soil does when it's holding moisture from somewhere. Not wet, but not dry either. At 18 feet, Marcus stopped and looked at Darius. Darius didn't say anything. He kept boring. They hit water at 21 feet. Not a dribble. Not the thin, dark seep you sometimes find below hardpan in a dry summer. Water that came up fast and pooled at the auger hole and kept coming, clear and cold enough that when Darius put his hand in it, he felt it for a full minute after he took it back out. He crouched there with his hand still dripping and looked at the water rising slowly in the borehole and didn't say anything for a while. Marcus sat back on his heels and looked at it too. "How much you think is down there?" he asked. Darius said he didn't know. He wasn't being modest. He genuinely did not know, and he thought it was important to say so. What he knew was that the water was there. It was cold. It was coming from depth, and it had been coming from depth for long enough to maintain moisture readings in the soil above it, even through 11 years of surface drought. The rest would take time. He called Warren that evening from a payphone at the CR51 gas station. His cell phone had been disconnected 2 months earlier. He'd been running lean since the purchase, and told him what they'd found. Warren was quiet for a bit. Then he asked how cold the water was. Darius said it was cold, colder than he expected. Warren said, "Artesian feed. Probably been there a long time." He said he'd be there Thursday. They pulled the collapsed culvert from the northern boundary 3 weeks later, Darius and Warren and Marcus, and a borrowed Case 580 backhoe that Warren's neighbor, a man named Earl Pickett from Centerville, let them use for 2 days in exchange for helping Earl pull fence on a back pasture the following weekend. Warren operated the machine. He had 40 years in equipment and could read a backhoe the way most people read a clock, efficient and without wasted motion. Darius and Marcus worked the chain around the failed culvert sections. The original corrugated steel had partially separated and collapsed in on itself over the years. Maybe 12 feet of it blocked, and it had to come out in pieces. Warren didn't say much during those 2 days. He got it done. The second afternoon it started raining. Just a light rain, not enough to mean anything, and they kept working. By 4 o'clock, the last culvert section was out, and the drainage channel was open, and you could hear, in the quiet under the rain, water moving where water had not been moving before. Slowly at first, then with more intention. The ground at the bend started moving soft and dark and wet. Warren backed the backhoe away and shut off the engine and got down and walked over to where the water was surfacing, pushing up slow through the disturbed earth at the channel edge, and he stood there for about 4 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." That was all he said. Then he climbed back up and drove the backhoe toward the trailer. By mid-August 2009, the creek was running. Not full, it was August, and it was Alabama, but running. By October, a neighbor from 2 parcels over, a cattle farmer named Bill Pruitt, stopped his truck on CR51 and watched it for a few minutes. He'd farmed that stretch for 22 years. He'd never seen water in that bed in the fall. He drove down to where Darius was pulling fence post and asked him what he'd done. Darius told him about the culvert. Pruitt looked at him a while. He was not a man who showed much on his face. He said, "Who told you to look for that?" Darius said, "My father taught me to read the soil." By the following spring, the Hargrove parcel had 3 functional water sources: the restored creek, the spring bore, and a seasonal pond that had reconstituted itself in the low southeast quadrant once the water table began recovering. The pond wasn't large, maybe a third of an acre, but it held water through the summer of 2010, which was a dry summer, and that fact alone told Darius what he needed to know about the depth and reliability of what was underneath. He put in a small cow-calf operation that spring. 47 head of Angus Hereford Cross, bought over the course of 8 weeks from 2 different sale barns, averaging $640 a head. He financed none of it. He'd spent the spring doing fence work and hay hauling for neighboring farms, $12 an hour, and he'd saved what he made. The total herd investment came to $30,080. He leased grazing rights on 8 of the parcel's acres to Bill Pruitt for $320 a month. Pruitt had been grazing that ground through a verbal arrangement the previous fall after he'd stopped his truck on CR 51 and asked what Darius had done. And that lease income covered the property tax and left a small operating margin. The forage quality on the parcel improved faster than anyone had projected. Not because Darius did anything dramatic. He seeded it with a mix of Bermuda grass and endophyte-free tall fescue in late September 2009, applied lime that winter based on the Auburn soil tests, and let the water do the rest. When soil has moisture access and a corrected pH, it tends to recover. That's not unusual. What was unusual was how fast. By midsummer 2010, Darius was seeing stand density on his improved pastures that a neighbor with good-looking ground would have been satisfied with. The soil test results from the Bend, the ones that had originally suggested organic activity, turned out to be the leading indicator. The ground wasn't dead. It had been dry. Those are not the same thing. He had the parcel appraised in January 2011. The appraiser, a woman out of Bessemer named Janet Corley, came out on a Wednesday morning and spent 2 hours walking it. She looked at the creek, the bore, the pond. She took her own soil samples. She went home and called Darius 4 days later. She put the parcel at $47,000, not because of the cattle, because of the water. A parcel with confirmed artesian flow, documented spring output, and restored surface water in Jefferson County, Alabama, carries different value than dry pasture. Corley told him the water rights alone, if he were to deed them separately, would support most of the number. The cattle and the improved forage brought the rest. He paid $5,000 for the land. He spent $2,400 on equipment rental and repairs in the first 18 months, and another $1,600 on seed, lime, and fencing materials. Total invested by January 2011, $9,000, plus his own labor and his cousins. Appraised value, $47,000. He did not sell. He had no reason to sell something that was becoming more valuable each year he held it. By 2014, Darius had expanded the herd to 91 head, added a hay operation on the driest 14 acres of the parcel, and had taken on a lease agreement for an additional 30 acres from the estate of a man named Gerald Hobson, whose 3 adult children lived in Atlanta and Birmingham and had no interest in working the ground. The Hobson lease ran $180 an acre per year for 3 years, $5,400 annually, which Darius used to service a small operating line he'd finally taken out at a credit union in Bessemer. His first borrowed money. He'd put it off as long as he could. Elmore Elliott's voice, passed through Warren's telling, was clear on the subject of debt. But a growing operation needs operating capital, and Darius had reached the point where the growth was real enough to justify the risk. He was not rich. He would not have said that. What he was, in 2014, was farming 42 acres that every qualified person in Jefferson County had written off and paying his bills from the proceeds of that ground, which was more than most people who'd walked that parcel in 2009 would have wagered on. He is 39 years old now. He runs a cow-calf operation and takes on contract grazing work in the summer. His father drove out to see the place 2 springs ago and walked the creek bed. He stopped at the bend where the auger hole had been. It's a proper shallow well casing now, capped and maintained, and he looked at the ground for a while the way he always looked at things. Darius asked him what he was thinking. Warren said he was thinking about Elmore's maps. There's a lot in that. There's the spring, and the culvert, and the $5,000 purchase that 40 people should have made and didn't. But there's also a pencil map in a filing cabinet in Bibb County, drawn by a man named Elmore Elliott in the 1960s, showing where water moved and pooled and disappeared on land that other men farmed without knowing what was underneath it. That map passed to Warren. Warren passed it in a different form to his son. Not as a document, as a way of looking. You don't find water by looking where the water is. You find it by learning to read the ground that should have water in it but doesn't, and asking why. Some people call that instinct. It isn't. It's attention applied over a long time, given to you by someone who applied it over a long time before you. Elmore Elliott paid attention for 60 years. Warren Elliott paid attention for 40 more. Darius sat down at a dry creek bend and noticed that the soil cracked different. The land was never dead. Nobody had been paying close enough attention to know it was alive.